Coming up in 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes maybe to be more precise, we're going to be joined by Dr. Jonathan and Tripp, and that means we're not going to trip over the words. Dr. Jonathan Tripp from Tripp Family Medicine will be coming along in just a few minutes. That is Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. We hope you can stick around for that. He'll be answering some of your questions, if you have them, about some health questions that you may have of your own. Also coming up just after 9 o'clock news, Rebecca Milsoyko from the Twin Falls City Council will join us for a few minutes as well. Have a conversation about some things that may be important, may be going on within city government. You may want to check that out too as well. In the meantime, what's the big story today? Well, the show is called Top Story, which means we often try to pull a story out, whether it be on the local level. Your critics never like this because if they don't, like your politics or your worldview or your philosophy, then they've got to argue with everything you talk about. But the top story today, clearly, is what happened in Israel yesterday, voting for the prime minister and his party. A lot of people may look at this and say, well, look, he only won a quarter of the seats available in the Knesset. That is the Israeli parliament. On the other hand, there are 14 or 15 parties that were running? So he won a huge block, and that means he can get together with a few other people and create a government, cobble a government together out of that. But it really runs counter to the narrative that the media had been preaching to us for several days. I'm reminded of the 2010 midterm elections in the United States. Right up until Election Day, you had all of the talking heads saying, well, conventional wisdom is, you could turn on MSDNC and Morning Joe, you could turn on CNN, you could turn on, even for some people on Fox were saying, well, it's we might see a few Republican gains. And if you looked at the newspapers and you looked at the op-ed pages, mainly dominated by the American left, they were all saying, oh, well, Americans don't really go for this Tea Party, Republican, conservative stuff. And then, bam, 60-some-odd seats swung Republican that night. The next morning, all of these people were sitting eating crow as they were making their television appearances. The fact of the matter is, if you live on one of the coasts in this country and you have very little contact with flyover country, and everywhere you go, you're surrounded by your fellow liberals, all of your clubs and your dining halls, wherever you go, and you see the same people all the time, and you have no social interaction with anybody else, then you believe that your small circle, that little bubble that you live in, is the world. What was it? Pauline Kael, she was a theater critic. She was at a party in Manhattan in 1972 after George McGovern had lost 49 states, running against Richard Nixon as Nixon was running for re-election. And she said, I just can't understand how Nixon won. Nobody I know voted for him. Again, she should have gotten out more often and perhaps gotten out of those swank Manhattan parties, and she might have actually found people who live and work and die in America, who pay most of the bills in America, and they would think differently, wouldn't they now? 10 minutes after 8 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. And we have a, relatively nice weather forecast ahead. By Friday, 76 and sun. Not quite as warm the next couple of days, but we'll be getting there gradually as we move toward the weekend. 42 at our studios. You're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. That means you can hear us anywhere all over the world on the web. And if you'd like to reach the program today, you can drop me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. That last name is Colley, bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. And the telephone number at our studio, 736-0300. That is 736-0300. From the Washington Post. Now, I looked at the Post website last night. I had some early text messages from friends of mine who, because of the fact that they are Jewish, they have some people in Israel that they are still close to. And they were able to tell me that Netanyahu had won this thing, despite what the polls say. Polling data in this day and age, I don't know what the media is talking about. Polling data is so scientific now. This isn't like 1948 with Dewey defeats Truman. That was the pollsters in September stopped taking polls because they said, well, it's done. We don't have that happen any longer. So the polling data couldn't be wrong. What could be wrong were people were trying to tell us that Netanyahu wasn't going to win, and they were hoping against hope that somehow there would be some sort of, the liberals don't necessarily believe in God, but that there would be some sort of flash of light and that somehow Netanyahu would then lose. So they were telling us throughout the afternoon yesterday, after the polls closed in Israel, I was looking at headlines on all of the major U.S. newspapers' websites, and they were all saying, too close to call, neck and neck, a dead heat. Does it remind you of those 2010 midterm elections for Congress here in the United States? Really, seriously, when you stop and think about it, it is almost identical. Or how about last year's elections when the Republicans took the U.S. Senate? And yet, right up until the end, you had all of the lefties in media saying, oh, not going to happen. Oh, no, Americans won't stand for it. Oh, no. Americans want gay marriage and to smoke dope and to have the country fall to pieces. Yeah. Well, it didn't happen, did it? So the Washington Post, I was looking at the website of the Washington Post last night, right up until I went to bed. And the Washington Post website still kept saying it was too close to call. Netanyahu had already given a victory speech. Oh, well, it's too close to call. This morning when I got out of bed, I looked at the same website, and here's the headline. Netanyahu sweeps to victory in Israeli election. They must have had can you imagine them pounding their fingers on the keyboard? As they had to type that out in anger. But President Obama doesn't like him, and that means nobody else around the world should like him, and that means Israelis shouldn't like him. They should all bow down before President Obama. Well, apparently they don't like Barack Obama in Israel whatsoever. Come to think of it, I've met people from a lot of countries overseas who have similar feelings about the man, and a good majority now, I think, of most Americans, too. It's 8:13. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. The headline, followed by this, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party won a clear and decisive victory in Israel's parliamentary elections, paving the way for him to serve a record-breaking fourth term as prime minister, according to an almost complete vote count on Wednesday. This may make President Obama rethink his approach to dealing with Iran, because this guy Netanyahu, he's pretty much got a mandate right now. If he wants to go over and smack the Iranians right in the nose, he'll likely do it. And despite the threats we've heard that the White House has threatened to shoot down Israeli planes, they wouldn't dare. Let me make that clear. They wouldn't dare at this point. If that happened, there would be impeachment proceedings on any number of counts against Mr. Obama over on Capitol Hill. And there would be other calls for him to leave the White House immediately for firing on a reliable ally. And then this comes from something called the New York Sun. The New York Sun was an ancient publication, went defunct. Now it is alive again on the web. And it's an editorial that says, will Obama concede? And I'll give you just a couple of sentences from it. As we see it, the writer says, no matter what happens, Mr. Obama's attempt to paint Mr. Netanyahu as a marginal, rejectionist figure is shown for what it is, a mark of disrespect for Israel itself. He should have stood on the sidelines. There you go. For all of the caterwauling that he and all of his minions and media did about Mr. Netanyahu coming to speak before a joint session of the U.S. Congress, claiming that this was all political and it was to help Netanyahu in his election prospects. Well, at the same time, Paul Begala, who worked for President Clinton and has been a longtime Democrat, what do you call it? I'm trying to find a nice word to say, a party hack. Begala and maybe even David Axelrod and some others were involved with this. They were advising the opposition in Israel. You heard yesterday that the prime minister there said that they were busing in Arabs to vote. The liberals were. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone were interfering in a U.S. election to that degree, we might take that as being, if not an act of war, certainly an act of treachery. So there you have it. The writer goes on to say, will Mr. Obama concede his error? In other words, he was wrong. Not for the first time, but he was wrong. One thing for Americans, the writer says, to keep in mind as the maneuvering begins is that neither the right nor the center or the left in Israel is enthusiastic about the Obama-Kerry negotiations with Iran, and they cite their evidence here. They cite their evidence. So no matter who the White House was backing, nobody in Israel, you might have a handful, but the people who've moved there and who've settled there did so for a reason. None of them want or are looking at a nuclear Iran without some trepidation, and they will take some action about it now at this point. We just heard that oil dropped $1 per barrel, right, around the world this morning. We could be paying some higher prices if this does take place, but remember, if Mr. Obama had gone ahead with that Keystone Pipeline, if Mr. Clinton way back in 1996 had gone ahead with ANWR in the northern slope of Alaska, we wouldn't have any worries. And we may not have any worries right now about our oil petroleum supplies because of all of the oil we've been pumping out of various shale beds in this country. So maybe it's time to finally clean up that viper's den in the Middle East, and maybe Mr. Netanyahu is finally going to do it. This has taken place throughout my lifetime. This is the story that has dominated my lifetime, I think like none other. I was just a boy in school when the 1967 war happened. And then I was in sixth grade when the 1973 war broke out. That was in October, remembering and thinking that we might possibly be going to war even with the Soviet Union at the time. It didn't happen. In fact, in both those wars, the Israelis ran circles around the enemy and pretty much just grabbed more territory, which they were later forced to give up after paying for it with blood. But this has been the most dominant issue, much more so than Northern Ireland ever was, which is a very quiet place now. Much more so than Tibet ever was, which is a very quiet place right now. Much more so even than the conflict between the Indians and the Pakistanis. The biggest fulcrum in the world for trouble is in the Middle East. And that is because going back to about 1970 when the hijackings first started, and then later the attack on the Israeli athletes at the Munich Games in 1972, all we have tried to do is appease. And we have told the Israelis they need to appease. And when they don't appease, we hit them over the head with a club. The only elected government in that part of the world. And we have to sit here and tell them they need to give up more. Constantly they hear that refrain from us, and you know what happens? Every time they've tried to make concessions, some nut job from the radical Islamic wing shows up with a bomb strapped to his chest, steps on a school bus, and blows up 30 school children. That, my friends, is what's at stake here, and it's got to come to an end eventually. And it's been going on for what, nearly 70 years in that part of the world? I really think that we ought to give these people wide latitude in cleaning up the mess. I've got more coming up. Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as online at newsradio1310.com. And I should point out 43 now, move up a little bit with our temperature, headed for a temperature in the mid-60s today, pretty much the same tomorrow, 76 on Friday. Then it cools down a little bit over the weekend. We had rain in the forecast for the weekend, but it looks like it's going to continue to be dry. Just some clouds. Maybe Saturday a lot of dark skies, but not a lot of moisture coming out of all of that. And then Sunday things begin to clear out a bit more as we head toward next week. Very unseasonable, I guess, in some spots, but we are now getting into, spring arrives in a couple of days. I don't know. Maybe we won't have to see any more snow again until sometime late in this calendar year. I've got more coming up. As I mentioned, the doctor will be in. Jonathan Tripp from Tripp Family Medicine coming up following the 8:30 break this morning. Also, Rebecca Milsoyko from the Twin Falls City Council coming up following 9 o'clock news. I've got a couple of questions for her. Perhaps you do too as well. Stick around. I was talking about the weather a few minutes ago. So I was out and about over the weekend walking around downtown Twin Falls, and then on Sunday I was up at Shoshone Falls and didn't realize it until I got out of bed Monday morning, but my skin was a little sore. My forehead and nose and I'd taken a little sun. Hadn't really thought about it while I was out walking around on, especially Sunday, what was mainly a cloudy day at the time when I was out, but still you've got the sun up there. You just don't see it as clearly through the clouds. So I was comparing that to something I read about a week ago. The actress Joan Collins has turned 81 years old. And the woman who did an interview with her about her birthday and a new book coming out said that Collins still has really good skin for someone who's 81. And the question was, how did you manage to keep all these years the skin without all of the tremendous problems with wrinkling and everything else? And she said, I stayed out of the sun. It's very simple. She said, you just don't go out in the sun a whole heck of a lot. She said, you get to a certain age, you're going to have age spots and those things. That's natural. But she said, you can, to some degree, control some of the wrinkling by staying, just not constantly baking your skin, which is going to be the subject of our discussion coming up in a few minutes with Tripp Family Medicine. They'll be joining us in studio, Dr. Jonathan Tripp, of course, and to Trip Family Medicine located at Fillmore Street in Twin Falls, directly across from the main post office. He'll be here and he'll be talking a little bit about some of the spring break things going on if your kids are going away for that, or just other points you need to know when you go outside, because we'll have spring planting coming along soon. We'll have other people who will be working outdoors a lot more. You'll be working out in the garden. What should you know about the sun's rays? And he'll talk with you about that coming up in just a few minutes, right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Also, I want to tell you about my friends at Western States Bus Services. They are currently looking for people to fill roles as school bus drivers in Twin Falls. Split shifts 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. Pay is $10.75 per hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. That is 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Hey, I came across something this morning on the AP Wire just before showtime, and I thought I've got to make a quick mention of this. Telemedicine, since we'll be talking about medicine anyway in a few minutes, telemedicine. Legislation outlining acceptable telemedicine practices in Idaho is on its way to the governor's desk. The Idaho Senate voted 31-3 to endorse the bill. The proposal has already passed the House. Should mention, too, the governor is scheduled to be with us on the program tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to be somewhat of a busy day here. I have Governor Otter scheduled for about 20 minutes to half an hour with us. And I also have the Chief Executive Officer of the John Birch Society, Arthur Thompson, scheduled with us tomorrow, too, as well. He's going to be doing a presentation tonight in Boise and one tomorrow night in Burley. And he's talking about the Pacific Free Trade Agreement and what you really need to know about that and how it could cost you a job. So he'll be joining us tomorrow as well on the program. When it comes to this telemedicine bill in Boise, the 3 Democrats who voted against the legislation argued they could not sign off on the bill's strict language banning doctors from prescribing abortion-inducing drugs via telehealth. Why is it? Timothy Dolan, who was the Roman Catholic Cardinal of New York City, said a few years ago, why is it that the left treats pregnancy as an illness? I mean, we all got here through pregnancy, didn't we? It's just, well, I guess they figured that in the future they'll all do test tubes. That way men and women don't have to be together and women won't feel oppressed. Yeah, that's the next leftist battlefront. Why is it, though, that they had to have this abortion-inducing drug in the telemedicine? They could not vote for, because this bill will help people out on other matters. If you've got a skin rash or if you've got some other issues and a doctor is talking to you, but he can examine you over that camera while you're sitting in a distant waiting room, that is wonderful. Way back in the early 1990s, the hospital in the little town where I grew up started doing a program like that with a large university some distance away. I was sitting there eating my dinner one night, looked up at the TV set, and there was the hospital from my hometown where I'd grown up. And I remember just looking at that, and I remember thinking to myself, wow, that's interesting. It caught my eye because it was hometown, and I washed dishes in that hospital late in high school and to put myself through college as well. But this has been done for a long time now, and it's a good thing. Why would they object simply because they can't have baby killing involved with it? Here's my take on all of this. You've got these very same lefties who say that it's wrong to take someone out and put them in an electric chair or give them some drugs, some cutthroat killer, or to fire them or put them up before a firing squad if they've committed some horrendous crime. That's wrong, but they always like to say, well, life begins at 7 years old. Yeah. Since we do not have a consensus in this country on where life begins. My side believes it's conception. Their side believes it's whatever arbitrary date they set. But since we do not have a standard answer, then it seems to me that you have to stop this abominable practice until we actually have an answer that says this is where it begins, and we're always told it's settled science, or we got to trust science. We've got global warming, and that's because it's settled science. But when it comes to this issue, they don't want to hear about science, and science has not settled the issue. Oh, I think it has, but they're not in agreement with it. Somebody has to grab these people by the short hairs and just yank them around for a little while and explain to them that getting a ticket to hell is just not the way to spend the rest of your life. We've got the doctor coming up in just a couple of minutes from Trip Family Medicine right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you this morning, 8:30 and 43 at our studios.